On the morning of August 1st, 1985, at approximately 11 o'clock, a man in a gray summer suit walked unannounced through the main entrance of the United States Embassy at 121 Via Veneto in Rome, Italy, and told the Marine Guard at the security desk that he needed to speak with someone from the Central Intelligence Agency. The man gave his name as Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko. He was 49 years old, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and sweating lightly in the August heat despite the marble chill of the embassy lobby. He carried no briefcase, no bag, nothing visible in his hands. He presented a Soviet diplomatic credential and stated calmly in accented English that he was a senior officer of the KGB and that he wished to defect to the United States government. The Marine Guard followed standard protocol, contacting the embassy's duty officer while directing Yurchenko to a supervised waiting room, an anteroom furnished with institutional chairs, a low table, and a shelf of outdated American magazines. Yurchenko sat. He did not touch the magazines. He placed his hands on his knees and waited with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 3 decades in an organization that teaches its people to control what they allow others to see. The duty officer arrived within minutes. According to the contemporaneous report filed that afternoon, Yurchenko stated that he was a Major General in the KGB's first Chief Directorate, the directorate responsible for all Soviet foreign intelligence operations, and that he had access to intelligence of significant value to the United States government. He had been in Rome receiving medical treatment, he explained, and had made his decision that morning. He declined to elaborate until he was speaking with a senior CIA officer. He made one specific request, that his name not be transmitted to any system that Soviet intelligence might monitor for at least 12 hours. The chief of station was notified. Secure telephone calls went to Washington. A senior CIA officer arrived at the embassy within 2 hours and was seated with Yurchenko in a more protected environment than the anteroom. By that evening, arrangements had been made. Before midnight, Vitaly Yurchenko was on a flight to the United States. He was 49 years old on that August morning, a Major General of the KGB with 27 years of institutional knowledge about Soviet intelligence operations in North America. The CIA believed it had just received one of the most significant defectors of the Cold War's final decade. They were not wrong about that. What they had not yet understood, what would take weeks to fully emerge, was that Yurchenko had not defected only for the reasons intelligence officers defect. He had also defected for a woman. The woman was in Montreal, and she did not want him. Within 94 days of that August morning, Yurchenko would be back in Moscow. 2 Americans would be exposed. A man in Annapolis would be arrested for a telephone call he had made 5 years earlier in the worst month of his financial life. A former CIA officer in New Mexico would roll out of a moving car in the dark and spend the next 17 years in a city he had chosen under circumstances he could not have fully imagined when he chose them. And the question of what Vitaly Yurchenko had really been, whether his defection was genuine, a controlled KGB operation, or something the Cold War's binary categories were not built to describe, would remain decades later open. If you find yourself drawn to the documented stories behind Cold War intelligence, the real operations, the human cost, the decisions that could not be undone, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover cases like this every week. Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko had been born on February 7th, 1936 in Anapa, a port city on Russia's Black Sea coast in the Krasnodar region. His father worked in the regional Soviet administrative structure. His mother was a schoolteacher. He came of age in the post-war Soviet Union, in a system that channeled ambitious young men into institutional paths, the military, the party, the security services, and rewarded those who navigated those paths with a combination of loyalty and disciplined competence. He showed aptitude in languages and physical training, attributes the Soviet security services actively sought, and entered the Soviet Navy as a young man before being recruited into the KGB in 1958 at the age of 22. His early career was in counterintelligence, the KGB's discipline of identifying threats to Soviet operations and Soviet personnel. He spent his first decade doing this work in ways that distinguished him sufficiently to earn foreign posting, which within the KGB was a mark of both trust and recognized ambition. His most formative overseas assignment came between 1975 and 1980, when Yurchenko served as Chief of Security at the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. The posting placed him at the center of Soviet intelligence activity in the American capital during the Cold War's most competitive period. He worked in an environment saturated with surveillance on both sides, American on Soviet, Soviet on American, and developed his operational instincts alongside his understanding of how the Americans actually functioned at the institutional level. He was not merely watching from a distance. He was managing the security of a diplomatic facility that the FBI was monitoring continuously, navigating the practical daily reality of operating inside a city that treated the presence of his embassy with active suspicion. He learned what it was like to move through a hostile environment. He also learned, in the specific way that only direct observation permits, that the American intelligence services were formidable in ways that Soviet institutional assessments sometimes understated, that they were methodical, well-resourced, and staffed by people who were genuinely capable at what they did. After Washington, Yurchenko returned to Moscow and eventually rose to a senior position heading the KGB First Chief Directorate's North American Department, the unit coordinating all KGB intelligence activity across the United States and Canada. By the early 1980s, he knew more about Soviet intelligence operations in North America than almost anyone outside the KGB's most senior leadership. He also knew, from 5 years in Washington, how the Americans thought and how they worked. What this meant in practical terms was considerable. The head of the North American department would have visibility into ongoing KGB operations against American targets, the identities of KGB officers operating in the United States under various forms of cover, the general methodology used to recruit American citizens as sources, and the analytical framework the KGB applied to understanding American intelligence capabilities. He would know, in broad terms, which American institutions the KGB was attempting to penetrate, and with what degree of success. He would have some knowledge of Soviet assets within American intelligence, Americans who had chosen, for their own reasons, to cooperate with Soviet intelligence, though the specific details of those sources would have been held more tightly within operational channels. He was, in the particular calculus of defector value, a source of exceptional potential. That knowledge was what the CIA wanted when he walked through the embassy door in Rome. But it was not, as would become clear in the weeks following his arrival in the United States, the only reason he had walked through it. The debriefings began at a secure CIA property in Fredericksburg, Virginia, a 2-story residence that combined the functions of controlled environment and comfortable temporary quarters, where Yurchenko met daily with a team of senior CIA officers from the Soviet division and worked through his professional history in the methodical sequence that defector debriefings required. The sessions were recorded, transcribed, and summarized for distribution within the relevant analytical divisions. A senior officer from the CIA's Soviet division and a rotating team of analysts met with Yurchenko 3 to 5 hours each day, moving chronologically through his career, asking him to describe assignments, operations, personnel, analytical frameworks, and activities across his 3 decades of KGB service. The material Yurchenko provided in the first weeks was, by all analytical assessments from the period, of genuine intelligence value. He provided details about KGB operations in Europe that corroborated existing assessments in some areas and offered new specifics in others. He described KGB organizational changes that had not been reflected in existing American assessments. He named personnel in the First Chief Directorate whose identities had been unknown. He provided details about Soviet analytical thinking on American capabilities and intentions that helped analysts calibrate their own assessments. By mid-August, the prevailing evaluation within the Soviet division was that Yurchenko was providing information of the quality that genuine senior defectors provided, the kind that improved the picture in ways too specific and too internally consistent to be manufactured. But in his first full week at Fredericksburg, Yurchenko also disclosed something his debriefers had not anticipated: a personal history that had been, by his own account, as central to his decision to defect as any professional calculation. Her name was Valentina Yereskovskaya. She was the wife of a Soviet diplomat then stationed in Ottawa, Canada. Yurchenko told his debriefers, in sessions whose content was later partially reconstructed through declassified material and investigative reporting, that he had developed a profound personal attachment to Valentina over several years, during the period when his responsibilities for North American operations had brought him into contact with the Soviet diplomatic community in Canada. The attachment had been, by his account, emotional rather than physical, but it had been the most significant personal relationship of his adult life, and he had defected partly, perhaps primarily, in the belief that the West could offer him what his Soviet life had not: a future with her. The CIA, processing this information and recognizing both its significance as a source of psychological vulnerability and what it implied about Yurchenko's investment in remaining in the West, made a decision that later analysts reviewing the case would identify as the most consequential operational error in the entire handling effort. They arranged for Yurchenko to travel to Montreal to see Valentina. The meeting was held in late August 1985, approximately 3 weeks after his defection. Yurchenko was transported to Montreal under controlled conditions and brought to a location where Valentina had agreed to speak with him. The CIA officers who had arranged the meeting waited outside. The conversation was brief. Valentina Yereskovskaya told Yurchenko that she did not want to leave her husband, that she had no interest in the life he was describing, and that she wanted nothing to do with the defector. She ended the meeting and left. The CIA officers who received Yurchenko afterward described him, in notes prepared that day, as shaken in a way that weeks of professional debriefing had not produced. He said very little on the drive back to the airport and less on the flight back to Virginia. The debriefing sessions that followed showed a measurable change, not in any single session that could be marked as a turning point, but gradually, across weeks, in the way that a person who has received an irreversible answer carries that answer forward through everything that follows. The CIA had flown its most significant defector in years to the woman whose answer would eventually send him home. Between early August and late October 1985, Yurchenko continued providing his debriefers with intelligence across a range of Soviet operations. Among his disclosures, 2 were of a different order than the rest. In late August, during the early weeks of the debriefings, he described an American signals intelligence specialist, a man who had approached Soviet intelligence directly, of his own initiative, in Washington, D.C. in early 1980, and had provided classified material for approximately 5 years before contact was severed. He provided a professional profile, a physical description, and operational details specific enough for the FBI to begin a formal identification process within 48 hours. The man was Ronald William Pelton. Pelton had been born on June 24, 1941 in Benton Harbor, Michigan, the son of a factory worker. He attended Indiana University, studying languages and communications, and following his graduation spent several years in the Army, developing the signals intelligence background that would define the first half of his professional life. In 1965, at the age of 24, he was hired by the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, Maryland. He would work there for the next 14 years. During that time, Pelton rose to a senior technical position in the NSA's Signals Intelligence Collection Division. The work was specific and demanding, not the high-profile analytical work that produced assessments for policymakers, but the quieter technical infrastructure of collection. The systems that gathered the raw communications, the programs that processed them, the architecture that determined what was collected and how. Pelton's role required both deep technical knowledge and the contextual understanding of how specific collection systems fit into the broader American intelligence enterprise. He understood not just how things worked, but what they were for, what a given program's disruption or compromise would actually mean for the intelligence picture it supported. He held clearances giving him access to programs at the highest levels of sensitivity, including one that operated under the code word Ivy Bells. Operation Ivy Bells was a joint program of the NSA, the United States Navy, and the CIA, initiated in the early 1970s with an objective that, even by the standards of the Cold War's most ambitious intelligence operations, was remarkable: to physically tap Soviet military communications cables lying on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, a body of water off the eastern coast of the Soviet Union through which Soviet submarine and naval command traffic flowed in enormous volume. Navy divers, working from specially modified nuclear submarines under conditions of extraordinary secrecy, had installed recording devices on these underwater cables. The devices captured Soviet naval communications that would otherwise have been entirely inaccessible. They were periodically retrieved and replaced by follow-on submarine missions, and the recordings gave American analysts access to Soviet Naval Command communications that planners had relied on for years. According to assessments from former officials who have spoken about the program in the years since its existence entered the public record, Ivy Bells was among the most productive signals intelligence programs of the Cold War's middle period. Pelton knew about it in detail, and by December 1979, when the NSA eliminated his position as part of a budget reduction and let him go after 14 years, his knowledge of Ivy Bells and of a range of other sensitive programs was one of the very few assets he had left, because everything else, by that point, was gone. The financial collapse had been gradual and then sudden. Pelton had spent at the outer edges of what he earned throughout his NSA career, a family to support, a lifestyle whose costs persistently exceeded his government salary, credit extended and extended again, debts that accumulated in the way that debts accumulate when payments are made against interest while the principal remains. By December 1979, his debts totaled approximately $65,000. He filed for bankruptcy that same month. The same month, the NSA informed him that budget reductions had eliminated his position. He was 38 years old, out of work, formally bankrupt, and in possession of 14 years of detailed knowledge about American signals, intelligence capabilities that the law strictly prohibited him from discussing with anyone outside his former employer. He had spent 14 years building expertise that had exactly one legitimate use. That use was now unavailable. On a day in early January 1980, court records would later establish the date as approximately January 14th. Ronald Pelton drove to the Soviet Embassy at 1125 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., walked through the public entrance, and told the duty officer that he was a former employee of the National Security Agency and that he had information the Soviet Union would find valuable. He was not recruited by Soviet intelligence. He recruited himself. The initial meeting at the embassy lasted less than an hour. Within weeks, Pelton had been connected with KGB intelligence officers who took his offering seriously enough to arrange a formal meeting in Vienna, Austria. He traveled to Vienna in January 1980 and spent several days with his handlers in a city well suited to these encounters, a neutral capital where both sides operated at close quarters, under the cover of its cosmopolitan ordinariness. In those meetings, Pelton described Operation Ivy Bells in technical detail, its existence, its location in the Sea of Okhotsk, the general design and function of the recording devices, the methods used to service and retrieve them. He described other NSA collection programs with similar specificity. His handlers were experienced enough to understand the value of what they were receiving and sufficiently practiced to give no indication of that understanding that Pelton might have found alarming. What Pelton could not have known, and what analysts reviewing the case would debate for years, was how much the KGB already understood about Ivy Bells before his first Vienna meeting. Some accounts from the period indicate that the Soviets had developed independent knowledge of the program through other intelligence channels, and that Soviet naval divers had located and recovered the tap device by the early 1980s. Before Pelton's 1983 and 1984 Vienna meetings confirmed its architecture in detail. Other accounts hold that Pelton's initial 1980 disclosure had itself guided the Soviet recovery. The precise sequence was never definitively established in the public record. What was established was that by the time of his later meetings, the device was gone, and what Pelton provided was either confirmation of what the Soviets already knew or the final intelligence layer atop information his earlier disclosure had set in motion. Either way, the damage was done. His confirmation gave the Soviets something lasting, certainty about how the Americans had been reading their communications, and the analytical framework to look for what else they had not yet found. Pelton returned to Vienna for additional meetings in 1983 and 1984, providing technical material about NSA collection programs and the architecture of American signals intelligence capabilities. The meetings were arranged through the dead drop protocols and signal systems the KGB used for exactly these purposes, and they proceeded without the kind of incident that would have attracted outside attention. He received approximately $35,000 over the course of the relationship, a sum that, measured against the scope and sensitivity of what he had provided, struck the analysts who later reviewed the case as a figure that revealed something important about Pelton's motivations. Money was part of it, in the immediate crisis sense that money had been everything in December 1979, but it was not the whole of it. The meetings gave him something else, a relationship in which his knowledge was treated as genuinely valuable, people who took his understanding of complex technical systems seriously and thanked him for sharing it. In the long contraction of his professional life, following his departure from the NSA, this had not been available from any other source. By 1985, contact with his Soviet handlers had been severed. He was living in Annapolis, Maryland, working periodic jobs in the private sector, managing an existence that was outwardly unremarkable. He was not living visibly beyond his means, not driving expensive cars or taking unusual trips abroad. He had, by the observable measures, stabilized. He was 44 years old. He had 5 years of contact with Soviet intelligence behind him, and a last meeting with his handlers that had been more than a year in the past. He may have believed in the way that people who have made irrevocable decisions sometimes allow themselves to believe, that the past had receded to a safe distance. There is no document that establishes what he believed in this period. What the documents establish is what he did. He worked, he lived, he went home in the evenings. He waited without knowing he was waiting for the morning in November 1985 when the men who had been watching him long enough to know what he had done would knock on the door of his Annapolis residence and ask him to talk. The second American Yurchenko named was Edward Lee Howard, and his case differed from Pelton's in almost every respect except one. Both men had been shaped by institutions that trusted them with things those institutions later decided they should not have been trusted with, and both had responded to that withdrawal of trust in ways whose consequences far exceeded anything the original institutional decision could have warranted. Howard had been born on October 27th, 1951, in Alamogordo, New Mexico. His father's military service meant Howard grew up in the transient culture of military families, moving between posts at intervals determined by the Army's requirements, beginning social relationships that assignment cycles then interrupted, developing the adaptability and the rootlessness that came with this in roughly equal measure. He graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, served in the Peace Corps in Colombia, and worked for the United States Agency for International Development in Peru. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him during these years, genuinely engaged with international work, capable, personable, and the kind of candidate the CIA actively recruited from the universities and aid organizations that produced people with the right combination of language skills, international experience, and clearable backgrounds. The CIA hired Howard in 1981. He was 29 years old. He went through the agency's training program for operations officers, tradecraft, surveillance detection, clandestine communications, the mechanics of recruiting and managing human sources. He performed well. He was identified for an assignment of particular significance. Case officer at the CIA's Moscow station, one of the most demanding postings in the clandestine service. Moscow station officers operated under conditions of near-continuous KGB surveillance, managed relationships with Soviet citizens, providing information to American intelligence at risk of their lives, and maintained communication systems designed to function under adversarial observation. The assignment was considered a distinction, the kind given to officers whose abilities were trusted and whose judgment was considered reliable under pressure. To prepare Howard for Moscow, the CIA read him into the materials he would need to operate there. He was given the identities of CIA assets within the Soviet Union who would fall under his care. He was briefed on the technical systems used to communicate with those assets under hostile conditions. He was provided the locations of dead drops and the communication protocols that constitute the operational architecture of the CIA's presence inside Moscow. Collectively, this was the most sensitive material the agency held in relation to its Moscow operations. The names of people whose access to information the United States depended on, and whose continued safety depended entirely on the CIA's ability to protect the fact of their cooperation. Howard received it in the ordinary institutional manner of an officer being prepared for an important assignment. In 1982 and early 1983, Howard underwent a routine polygraph examination as part of the pre-posting security review. The polygraph produced deceptive readings. In the subsequent interview, he admitted to things he had not disclosed during his original hiring: drug use, petty theft, personal history that the CIA's security standards could not accommodate. The Moscow posting was canceled immediately. On May 2nd, 1983, Edward Lee Howard was fired from the Central Intelligence Agency. He was 31 years old. He had been given the names of people whose lives depended on the secrecy of those names, and the institution that had given him those names had then concluded that he could not be trusted and had shown him the door. Howard's reaction was not acceptance. He moved with his wife Mary and their infant son Lee to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he found work as an economic analyst for the state legislature. He drank heavily. He was angry in the particular way of a person who has been shown the interior of something exceptional and then been told he could not enter, a grievance that had nowhere useful to go, and that he found no productive means of managing. He spoke to former CIA colleagues in ways that made some of them uncomfortable. He told at least one person that the agency had destroyed his career without justification. According to court documents and investigative reporting compiled in connection with related proceedings, Howard made contact with Soviet intelligence in late 1984. The precise mechanics of the initial approach have never been definitively established in the public record, in part because Howard was never extradited and never subject to American criminal proceedings, and in part because the CIA's full account of the damage he caused remained classified for many years. What was established, through internal CIA investigation, testimony in related proceedings, and Howard's own memoir published in 1995 under the title Safe House, was the nature of what he disclosed. He told the Soviets which CIA officers were operating inside Moscow and how to identify them. He explained how the agency communicated with its sources under KGB surveillance, the technical systems, the signals, the mechanics of maintaining contact inside a city designed to make such contact impossible. He gave them the dead drop locations and emergency protocols that constitute the operational skeleton of the CIA's Moscow presence. The material he provided was not speculative or second-hand. He had been briefed on it directly, in preparation for a posting he never filled, and had retained it with the completeness of a man who had an excellent memory and who had, for 2 years, been angry enough to consider what else that memory might be used for. In Moscow, CIA sources began disappearing from their positions. Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet military scientist who had spent years providing the CIA with technical intelligence about Soviet military electronics and aviation systems that American defense planners relied on directly, was arrested by the KGB in June 1985, 2 months before Yurchenko defected and named Howard as a source. Tolkachev was executed in 1986. He was one of several. The full accounting of the damage Howard caused was never made public, in part because making it public would have required acknowledging the identities of specific programs and specific people whose exposure would compound the original harm. What former CIA officials who have spoken about the case in broad terms in subsequent years agreed on was that Howard's disclosures compromised the agency's Moscow operations more fundamentally than any single event in the station's history to that point. The KGB had been working methodically to identify the people providing information to the Americans in Moscow. Howard had given them the architecture that made those identifications possible, and the consequences had been materializing in the form of arrests in the months before anyone in Washington connected them to a fired operations officer living quietly in Santa Fe. When Yurchenko named Howard in late August 1985, the FBI's counterintelligence operations moved immediately to assess the disclosure and establish surveillance. The problem was specific and urgent. Howard was a civilian with no institutional constraints on his movement. He could travel at any time. He was also, critically, a man who had been trained by the CIA to detect surveillance and to operate in conditions of adversarial observation. He knew the techniques the FBI would use to watch him, because those techniques were part of what the CIA had taught him. The FBI established coverage of Howard in Santa Fe, but it was not, in the assessment of the reviews conducted afterward, sufficiently intensive for the specific risk he represented. On the evening of September 21st, 1985, 21 days after Yurchenko named him, Edward and Mary Howard attended a dinner party at the home of friends in Santa Fe. The FBI surveillance team assigned to Howard that evening maintained their standard coverage, watching his vehicle, documenting arrivals and departures, tracking what they expected would be an unremarkable evening that ended with him going home. Howard had been preparing for something different. He had constructed in the weeks before that evening a device that CIA tradecraft training had described during his operational preparation. He built it himself, at home, using materials available at ordinary retail stores. It was a torso-shaped form mounted on a spring mechanism, a device his training referred to as a jack-in-the-box. Collapsed flat in a bag, it was invisible. When the bag was opened and the mechanism released, the form sprang upright in a seated position. Placed in a passenger seat, it presented, at the distance of a following surveillance vehicle, the silhouette of a seated passenger. He explained to Mary Howard exactly what she needed to do and when. They left the dinner party at approximately 9:30 p.m. and got into their car. Howard was in the passenger seat. Mary was driving. The FBI surveillance vehicle followed at its standard distance. They drove south along a residential road through a section of Santa Fe where the route included a curve that briefly interrupted direct visual observation from behind. At that curve, Mary Howard reached into a bag in the back seat and released the mechanism. The form sprang upright in the passenger seat. Edward Lee Howard opened the passenger door and rolled out of the moving car. He landed in brush at the edge of the road, rose, and moved away on foot. Mary continued driving at normal speed, a car with two apparent occupants proceeding at an ordinary pace toward home. The FBI surveillance team followed the car. They watched what they believed were two people park in a driveway and go inside. They documented the end of a routine evening. Howard made his way to a location where he had arranged transportation in advance, traveled by a sequence of connections designed to leave a fragmented trail, and reached the Albuquerque International Sunport. He boarded a flight to New York City. From New York, he flew to Helsinki, Finland. From Helsinki to Vienna, Austria, where he made contact with Soviet intelligence officers who had been notified to expect him. From Vienna, he was moved to Moscow. He arrived in late September 1985. He was 33 years old. He had left behind a wife, a son, and a country. Mary Howard was questioned extensively by FBI agents in the days following her husband's escape. She acknowledged having driven the car. She acknowledged the device in the bag and her role in deploying it. She was never charged with any offense. She remained in Santa Fe with their son Lee, in the particular legal and social position of a person whose spouse has committed an act of extraordinary consequence and then made himself permanently unreachable. Not dead, which would have produced a defined and navigable grief, but gone in a way that produced something considerably more complicated. The FBI's review of the surveillance failure that allowed Howard's escape was conducted with the institutional self-examination that such an operational loss compels. The central finding was uncomfortable in its directness. The coverage of a CIA-trained operations officer had proven inadequate in ways that, in retrospect, were predictable. Howard had been trained to detect and evade exactly the techniques the FBI employed. He had studied those techniques during his CIA service. He knew the distances, the vehicles, the patterns. The gap between what the FBI was doing and what Howard had prepared to counter was wide enough to be exploited on a residential road in the dark, with a device he had built from materials available at any hardware store. The review produced procedural recommendations for future cases involving subjects with professional intelligence training. It did not produce Edward Lee Howard. He was in Moscow. He would not be coming back. In Fredericksburg, Virginia, Yurchenko's debriefing sessions continued through September and October. He answered questions. He provided details that were checked against existing intelligence and found, in most cases, accurate. He occupied his days in the way that defectors in long-term secure handling arrangements occupy them: reading, eating meals prepared by the officers assigned to his residence, watching American television, moving through controlled routines from which the ordinary coordinates of a life had been entirely removed. He thought often about Valentina Yeroskovskaya. He thought about Montreal. He thought about what she had said and what it meant that she had said it. By October, the change that had been gradual became more visible. He was less engaged in debriefing sessions, more likely to sit quietly when questions gave him room to speak. He returned in conversation to personal matters: his daughter back in Moscow, his early KGB postings, memories that had no operational relevance, but that accumulated in sessions as evidence that his attention was moving backward rather than forward. The CIA psychiatrist attached to his case documented this pattern in assessments prepared through October, characterizing it as reintegration failure. The recognized pattern in defector handling, when a source's psychological orientation shifts from building a new existence to rejecting it. The Montreal meeting had been a precipitating event. The CIA had limited tools for addressing what it was observing. On the evening of November 2nd, 1985, Yurchenko told his handler that he wanted to go to a restaurant in Georgetown, Au Pied de Cochon, a French bistro at 1329 Wisconsin Avenue Northwest that he had visited several weeks earlier. The request was approved. Yurchenko and his handler arrived at approximately 8 o'clock and were seated at a table near the rear of the dining room. Au Pied de Cochon was small and busy, tables close together, the atmosphere of an ordinary Georgetown Friday evening. Yurchenko ordered dinner and wine. He was quiet in the way he had been quiet for weeks, attentive to the food and the room, speaking occasionally, but at the particular remove of a person whose conversation is happening in front of a decision that has already been made. At some point during the meal, Yurchenko said he was going to the bathroom. He did not return. His handler waited. Several minutes passed. An inquiry was made. The men's room was empty. By the time the handler reached the restaurant's rear exit, Yurchenko had been on Wisconsin Avenue for several minutes. He hailed a taxi and directed the driver to the Soviet Embassy on 16th Street Northwest. On November 4th, 1985, Yurchenko appeared at a press conference at the Soviet Embassy before an assembled group of journalists. He was composed and specific. He stated that he had been drugged and abducted by CIA agents in Rome while walking near the Vatican, that he had been held against his will for months at a house in the American countryside, and that he had only recently managed to reach Soviet diplomatic protection. He denied having defected voluntarily. He denied having provided any intelligence to American authorities. The CIA issued a statement characterizing Yurchenko's claims as fabricated and his original defection as genuine. The Soviet Foreign Ministry issued a counterstatement. Journalists pressed both sides for verifiable specifics. Neither side provided any. The dispute generated 2 weeks of diplomatic friction and extensive press coverage that produced considerable debate and no resolution. On November 6, 1985, Vitaly Yurchenko boarded an Aeroflot flight at Dulles International Airport and returned to Moscow. He was accompanied to the departure gate by 2 officers from the Soviet Embassy. He did not speak to journalists. Yurchenko's departure did not suspend the FBI investigations he had set in motion. Ronald Pelton was still in Annapolis. The case against him was still being constructed. On November 24th, 1985, 18 days after Yurchenko's return to Moscow, FBI agents made contact with Pelton at his Annapolis residence. They identified themselves, indicated their purpose in general terms, and asked whether he was willing to speak with them. He agreed. The conversation extended over several hours at an FBI facility, with appropriate legal advisements given at the relevant points. Pelton did not confess in explicit terms, but his responses to specific questions demonstrated knowledge that only participation in the events described could have produced. He referenced Operation Ivy Bells in ways that established his understanding of the program's architecture and his role in its disclosure to Soviet intelligence. When asked about the Vienna meetings, he provided details consistent with what FBI investigators knew from other sources and that could not have been obtained from any public record. At the conclusion of the interview, he was placed under arrest. A search of his Annapolis residence was conducted under warrant. It produced bank records, correspondence, and financial documentation corroborating the monetary dimensions of the case. The records showed patterns of cash receipts whose timing tracked against the meeting schedule Yurchenko had described in his debriefings. Janet Pelton learned of her husband's arrest that same morning. By all subsequent accounts, including the conclusions of the FBI's investigation of her knowledge and involvement, she had been unaware of the activities that had led to it. She had known the bankruptcy. She had known the financial difficulty that had defined the early years of their marriage and the periodic improvements that followed. She had not known about Vienna or about the telephone call to 16th Street Northwest or about the men her husband had met in European hotel rooms and what he had told them. She was not charged with any crime. The couple had children whose experience in the weeks and months following the arrest followed a pattern that had become recognizable across espionage cases of this type. The press identified the family quickly. School became difficult. The social landscape that had been ordinary, the neighbors, the parents of classmates, the particular geography of a family's daily life, changed in ways that were not dramatic, but that were consistent and cumulative, a gradual contraction of what had previously been normal. The Pelton children were not old enough to fully understand what their father had done or why. They were old enough to understand that something had been done, that it was serious, and that other people knew about it. This combination, partial understanding, full exposure, produced the particular condition of children of arrested parents, knowing enough to feel the weight of it, and not enough to contextualize it in ways that might have made the weight bearable. Pelton's trial began in the United States District Court for the District of Maryland in the spring of 1986. The proceedings confronted the central difficulty of espionage prosecutions. The government's most powerful evidence concerned programs so sensitive that presenting them in full in open court would compound the original harm of their disclosure. Prosecutors managed this through a combination of closed sessions, stipulations, and the testimony of intelligence officials speaking in carefully limited terms about the nature and significance of what had been compromised. Former and current NSA and intelligence community officials testified that the material Pelton had provided was of genuine national security significance without being required, in open session, to specify exactly what that significance was. The defense challenged the admissibility of Pelton's post-arrest statements and pressed on the foundational issue. The government's original identification had come from Yurchenko, a man who had publicly denied providing any intelligence to American authorities, who had voluntarily returned to the Soviet Union, and who therefore had documented personal and institutional incentives to say whatever the KGB required him to say. It was a legitimate argument. It was not, in the end, the argument that determined the verdict. The statements Pelton himself had made during his own interview, the knowledge he had demonstrated, the program details he had confirmed, were the evidence that could not be explained away by characterizing its source. Ronald Pelton was convicted on 3 counts of espionage and sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences, plus an additional 10 years. He was 45 years old at sentencing and was transported to a federal correctional institution to begin what would become 30 years of incarceration. The judge at sentencing addressed not only what Pelton had done, but the arithmetic of it, the programs he had compromised, the period over which the compromise had occurred, and the specific calculation that a man who had once served his country at the NSA had spent the years immediately following that service providing its adversary with the technical knowledge required to understand and counter what the NSA did. The sentence was as large as federal sentencing permitted. It was structured as 3 concurrent life terms rather than 3 consecutive ones, which meant Pelton would be eligible eventually for parole review, a provision the judge noted without apparent enthusiasm. He was released on May 24, 2015, at the age of 73. The programs he had compromised were by that point either formally declassified or so thoroughly superseded by subsequent technological development that their sensitivity had been substantially reduced. Operation Ivy Bells had entered the public record through a combination of prior press reporting and the trial proceedings themselves. What the Soviets had been able to do with the detailed technical knowledge Pelton provided between 1980 and 1984, the specific countermeasures they had developed, the collection capabilities they had identified and neutralized, remained classified. Janet Pelton had rebuilt what could be rebuilt in the years of her husband's incarceration. The marriage had not survived. The specific trajectory of her life following the arrest was not publicized. She had not sought attention, and the relevant institutions had not compelled it. What the general contours of that life consisted of, extrapolated from the circumstances, was the work of constructing a daily existence around an absence and a revelation that had arrived simultaneously. Her husband was gone, and the reason he was gone had rewritten the meaning of the years before he left. She had not known. The legal system verified that she had not known. The verification resolved the legal question without resolving the one that is harder to answer. How a person locates herself in the aftermath of a discovery that reframes everything she thought she understood about her own life. In Moscow, Edward Lee Howard settled into the existence that defectors and emigres settle into when the alternative is unavailable. The Soviet Union assigned him an apartment and a stipend. He worked in advisory capacities for Soviet and later Russian institutions that found use for his knowledge of American intelligence operations. The specific nature of that work was not made part of any accessible record. The KGB's use of Howard's information, however, had left a record of a different kind, one written in the careers and lives of the people he had identified. The CIA assets whose names and methods Howard had disclosed had not been abstract intelligence assets. They had been people with jobs, families, and daily lives that continued entirely normally until the morning that KGB officers appeared and ended them. Some were reassigned to positions where their access to sensitive information was neutralized without immediate arrest. Others were interrogated, imprisoned, or executed. Tolkachev was the most documented case, but the full scope of the arrests connected to Howard's disclosures was never made public, and former officials who have addressed the matter in broad terms have consistently described the damage as extending well beyond any single name. Howard lived with this knowledge. He had it before he left Santa Fe, and he carried it to Moscow, and he carried it through 17 years of Russian existence. Whether and how he processed it, whether he found ways to diminish its weight, or whether it was the thing the alcoholism was partly managing, or whether he arrived at some accounting of himself that felt adequate, is a question his memoir raised without answering. The memoir was a careful document. It disclosed what Howard had decided to disclose and framed what he had done in terms that he controlled. The people it was most directly about had no opportunity to respond. He drank heavily. He said so himself. In Safe House, the memoir he published in 1995 while still living in Moscow, the book was partial by necessity. Some things remained classified. Howard was still alive under Russian protection, and the story of what he had done and why did not admit of clean telling. But the alcoholism it described was corroborated by multiple independent accounts from journalists and researchers who encountered him during those years. He attributed it, in the memoir's more candid passages, to the psychological condition of a person who cannot return to the place that formed him, the particular combination of isolation, unresolvable guilt, and grievance that his Moscow existence provided no means to address. He wrote about his son Lee with evident difficulty. Lee had been an infant when Howard left Santa Fe in September 1985. He grew up in New Mexico with his mother, without his father in any practical sense, in a household shaped by an event that had occurred before Lee could form memories of it, and that could not be adequately explained as he grew old enough to ask what had happened and why. Howard's passages about Lee read against the book's otherwise controlled prose, as the places where the control gave way. He described wanting Lee to understand that the decision to leave had not been a decision against Lee. These are the kinds of distinctions that make sense to the person who is making them. Mary Howard rebuilt what she could in Santa Fe. She had been in the car on the night of September 21st, 1985, and had done what her husband asked, and she had never been charged. She had also never been provided with a category adequate to the specific nature of what she had done and who she was in relation to it. She raised Lee alone. Her husband was alive and permanently elsewhere, and then eventually dead. On July the 12th, 2002, Howard died at his dacha outside Moscow. Russian authorities described the death as accidental. He had fallen and broken his neck. He was 50 years old. He had spent 17 years in a city he had chosen under circumstances he had not fully imagined, and he had died there without ever having seen his son grow up, and without having found, in his published account, or in any documented interview, a framework in which the harm he had caused and the life he had traded it for could be held together in a way that made clear sense. Vitaly Yurchenko arrived in Moscow on November 6, 1985, to coverage from Soviet state television, footage at the airport, officials surrounding him, brief statements consistent with the kidnapping account he had given at the embassy press conference. He returned to his apartment. His KGB career did not resume in any operational sense. Officers who had been exposed to Western intelligence services, whatever the circumstances of the exposure, were not assigned to roles with access to current operations. Yurchenko was given a nominal position, drew his salary, received his pension in due course, and stayed away from anything sensitive. In the post-Soviet period, he became gradually more accessible to Western researchers and journalists. He maintained versions of the kidnapping account in early interviews, and then, in later conversations, acknowledged elements of his situation with a candor that suggested the scripted version had grown tiresome even to him. He did not explain the Montreal meeting publicly. He did not provide a comprehensive account. He acknowledged in some of the later interviews that the period in the United States had been difficult in ways he did not elaborate. Whether Yurchenko had been a genuine defector who returned, or a deliberate KGB operation dispatched to deliver specific information and then recross, to identify Pelton and Howard while limiting the broader damage a comprehensive defection would have produced, remained unresolved within the intelligence community that had handled him. The plant theory pointed to the precision of his disclosures. He had named Pelton and Howard while leaving a significant number of other potential leads undeveloped, and the scope of operational damage from 4 months in American custody was considerably less than experienced analysts believed a genuinely comprehensive defection by a North American department chief would have caused. It pointed also to the efficiency with which Howard had been warned, through KGB channels, the theory held, in time to prepare and execute his escape before the FBI could move to an arrest. And it pointed to the fact that Yurchenko's redefection, with its carefully staged press conference, produced a counter-narrative that publicly embarrassed the CIA and sowed genuine doubt about its handling capabilities. The genuine defector theory pointed to everything that the plant theory required dismissing: the Montreal meeting, the documented psychological deterioration through October, the psychiatrist's assessments, the observable change in Yurchenko's manner and engagement across weeks of daily contact. Intelligence officers who had managed defectors over careers pointed out that staging a defection of that duration and psychological complexity without any element unraveling, under sustained close observation by experienced professionals, was an extraordinarily difficult technical feat. They also pointed to something more fundamental. Human beings sometimes do exactly what they appear to have done. They defect for personal reasons, find those reasons frustrated, and go home. The Cold War intelligence literature was full of complicated people who had made decisions under pressure and then made different decisions when the pressure changed. Yurchenko, on this reading, was not an operation. He was a man who had tried something and found it unbearable. The debate was not resolved because the evidence required to resolve it was either destroyed in the chaos of the Soviet Union's eventual dissolution or remained in archives that have not been made accessible to outside researchers. The case became, in the literature of Cold War intelligence history, a standard example of the irreducible ambiguity that characterized the era's most significant operations, the impossibility of knowing, with confidence, what any given individual within those systems was actually doing and why. Yurchenko was still alive as of the most recent credible reporting, having reached his late 80s in the city he had chosen to return to. He had never fully explained himself, and the available evidence was not sufficient to explain him without his cooperation. What does a case like this mean, evaluated not in operational terms, not in terms of what the KGB gained, or what the CIA lost, or whether Yurchenko was genuine or controlled, but in terms of the people who moved through it and the lives they left behind? Ronald Pelton made his decision in the worst month of his financial life. He was 38, bankrupt, recently unemployed, and in possession of knowledge he had spent 14 years accumulating that the law now prohibited him from using in any legitimate way. He drove to a building on 16th Street Northwest and walked through a door. The decision took less than an hour to execute and 30 years of federal incarceration to discharge. The programs he compromised degraded over the subsequent decade as technology advanced and new systems superseded the ones he had described. The intelligence aged out of relevance. The human cost did not age with it. Janet Pelton spent those 30 years managing the aftermath of a discovery that had rewritten the context of her marriage without changing a single event within it. She had been the person most proximate to a man conducting espionage for 5 years and had not known it. This is simultaneously a statement about her and a statement about the secret, that it was maintained with sufficient discipline that the person closest to it had no access to it. The discipline required to maintain a secret of that magnitude across 5 years of domestic life against the ordinary pressures of shared existence and financial stress was the same professional competence 14 years the NSA had trained Pelton to exercise. He brought his professional skills home and applied them to the protection of the thing that would eventually destroy what the home contained. Edward Lee Howard had been trusted with the names of people whose lives depended on his silence, and then the institution that trusted him decided his silence could not be relied upon and dismissed him. The decision was correct in the narrow sense that the polygraph findings were real and the security concerns were legitimate. What the decision did not account for, what no policy or protocol then in place required anyone to account for, was what happened to a person who had been given those names and then been escorted from the building. Howard had the names on May 2nd, 1983, when he was fired, and he had them when he made contact with Soviet intelligence, and he had them in Santa Fe and in Vienna and in Moscow. He carried them forward from the day they were given to him, and the institution that had given them to him had then acted as though the act of dismissal returned possession of them to the institution's control. It did not. The people whose names he carried, the Soviet citizens working for the CIA in Moscow, whose access to military and security information American planners depended on, had no role in any of this. They had made their choices in their own contexts, under their own pressures, and had placed their safety in the hands of an institution that had then given one of its officers the means to betray them and failed to adequately manage the risk that dismissing that officer created. Tolkachev had trusted a system that trusted Howard. That was what the trust had cost him. Mary Howard drove the car on the night of September 21st, 1985. She raised Lee alone in Santa Fe for the 17 years of her husband's Moscow life, and then for all the years after his death. She was never charged. She had not decided to commit espionage. She had driven a car because her husband asked her to, in a moment when the full parameters of the decision were not entirely available to her, and she lived with all of it: the night itself, the FBI interviews, the years of single parenthood, the permanent geographical inaccessibility of her husband, in a city where the story was known and could not be left behind. The Cold War's intelligence operations produced, in their cumulative effect, an enormous literature of assessments, after-action reviews, and declassified histories, analyzing what had happened in operational and strategic terms. They produced a smaller literature about the people who had moved through those operations at the human level, and a smaller literature still about the people adjacent to those people, the spouses who had not known, the children who had been present when the agents arrived, the parents and siblings who absorbed consequences they had no role in generating. These categories of harm do not appear in the damage assessments that intelligence officials prepared. They do not map onto the categories that operational reviews used to measure success and failure. They were the remainder, the portion of the total cost that did not show up in the classified reports and that compounded silently across years and generations. There is a version of the Yurchenko case that treats it primarily as an intelligence puzzle: genuine or plant, success or failure, CIA embarrassment or KGB masterpiece. It is a compelling puzzle, and the people who built careers thinking about these questions brought genuine sophistication to it. But the puzzle frame requires treating the people inside the case as pieces in a problem to be solved. Yurchenko as a variable whose value is unknown, Pelton and Howard as assets and liabilities to be assessed, their families as collateral circumstances outside the frame of analysis. The families were not outside the frame, they were inside it. They simply had no role in defining the terms. The FBI investigators building espionage cases, the KGB officers running American assets, the CIA officers managing defectors in Fredericksburg, all were operating within the logic of institutions engaged in a competition that their frameworks treated as primary. The children of people inside that competition were secondary. The spouses were secondary. The question of what a dismissed operations officer might do with the names of sources he had been given was, in May 1983, a secondary question. It stopped being secondary when the arrests began in Moscow. It stopped being secondary when Lee Howard grew up in New Mexico without a father. It does not become secondary again by virtue of having eventually been answered. On the evening of November 2nd, 1985, at a table near the rear of Au Pied de Cochon on Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown, a man said he was going to the bathroom and did not come back. The table was cleared. Other diners filled the seats. The restaurant continued its Friday evening. The CIA officer who had been sitting across from the empty chair waited the necessary minutes, checked the necessary room, and then stood on Wisconsin Avenue in the November air, understanding what had happened. On the sidewalk, Vitaly Yurchenko was already in a taxi, already moving north toward 16th Street, already done. He had been 49 years old when he walked into the American Embassy in Rome on an August morning. He was still 49 years old when he walked out of a French restaurant on a November night. In the 94 days between those two moments, he had identified Ronald Pelton, a former NSA employee who had called the Soviet embassy himself in January 1980 and who would spend the next 30 years in federal prison for what he sold, and Edward Lee Howard, a former CIA officer who had rolled out of a car in Santa Fe and would spend the next 17 years in Moscow for what he had taken when he left. He had traveled to Montreal and received an answer that cost him the future he had imagined. He had sat across a restaurant table from his handler and decided, at some point during an ordinary Friday dinner, that what he had come to the West for was not available. He went home. Ronald Pelton was 73 years old when he was released from prison in May 2015. He had been 38 years old when he made the call and 44 years old when it caught up with him. The period in between, 6 years of conducting espionage and 30 years of legal consequence, constituted the central fact of his adult life. Edward Lee Howard was 50 years old when he died at his dacha outside Moscow in July 2002. His son Lee was in his mid-20s. Howard had left when Lee was an infant and had been unreachable ever since, living, as far as his son was concerned, in a place that had no address that could be visited and no door that would open to let a son back into a father's life. He had not been dead for those years. He had been somewhere specific and completely inaccessible, and then he died, and became inaccessible in a different and more permanent way. The table at Au Pied de Cochon, where Yurchenko sat on the evening of November 2nd, 1985, is still there. Nothing on it or near it records what was decided at that table, or who left through which door, or what the leaving cost. Diners have sat at it on every Friday evening since, and the evenings have passed, and the restaurant has continued, and the table remains. That is, in the end, the most accurate image available, not the drama of a single defection or escape or arrest, but the plain fact of the table persisting, while the people who sat at it lived with what they had chosen, paid for it across years and decades, and in some cases did not recover. The table does not record any of this. Tables never do. The record exists elsewhere, in federal court filings, in the classified damage assessments that may never be fully released, in the lives of people whose names do not appear in any document, and in the particular silence of Lee Howard growing up in New Mexico without a father who was not dead but might as well have been, and in Janet Pelton navigating 30 years of absence that the legal system had determined was not her fault, but that had shaped everything anyway. That is where the record lives, not on the table, in the people who had no say in what was done at it.